Here we are. We're on our last chapter today, guys. It's been an amazing book so far, and it's as good as I remember it. And we have read all these chapters, and we just have one left called Goodbye, Grandma. Now, yesterday, Marvellous Medicine number 4, it made things smaller. So, I wonder what they're going to do with it. I'm not going to tell you what I think. Let's read it and have a look. So, Goodbye, Grandma. There's still something you've left out, Mr. Cranky said. I can't think of what it could be, George said. Give it up, Mrs. Cranky said. Pack it in. You'll never get it right. Mr. Cranky looked very forlorn, so it means he's really upset and he's a bit miserable and sad. He's a bit fed up. George looked pretty fed up too. He was kneeling on the ground with a spoon in his hand and a cup of full medicine in the other. The ridiculous tiny brown hen was walking slowly away. At that point, Grandma came striding into the yard. From her enormous height, she glared down at the 3 people below her, and she shouted, What's going on around here? Why hasn't anyone brought me my morning cup of tea? It's bad enough that I have to sleep in the yard with the rats and the mice, and I'll never be blowed if I'm going to starve as well. No tea, no eggs and bacon, no buttered toast. I'm sorry, Mother, Mrs. Cranky said. We've been terribly busy. I'll get you something right away. Let George get it, lazy little brute, Grandma shouted. Just then the old woman spotted the cup in George's hand, and she bent down and peered into it. She saw it was full of brown liquid. It looked very much like tea. Oh, she cried, ha ha, so that's your little game, is it? You look after yourself all right, don't you? Make sure you've got a nice cup of tea and morning tea. But you didn't think to bring one to your poor old Grandma. I knew you were always a selfish pig. No, Grandma, said George. That isn't. Don't lie to me, boy, the enormous old hag shouted. Pass it up here this minute. No, cried Mrs. Cranky. No, Mother. Don't. That's not for you. Now you're against me too, shouted Grandma. My own daughter trying to stop me having breakfast, trying to starve me out. Mr. Cranky looked up the horrid old woman and he smiled sweetly. Of course it's for you, Grandma, he said. Why don't you take it and drink it while it's nice and hot? Don't think I won't, Grandma said, bending down from her great height and reaching out a huge horny hand for the cup. Hand it over, George. No, no, Grandma, George cried, pulling away the cup. You mustn't. You've not got to have it. Give it to me, boy, yelled Grandma. Don't, cried Mrs. Cranky. That's George's Marvellous. Everything round here's George's, shouted Grandma. George this, George that. I'm fed up with it. She snatched the cup out of little George's hand and carried it high up, out of reach. Drink it up, Grandma, Mr. Cranky said, grinning hugely. Lovely tea. No, cried the other 2. No. But it was too late. The ancient beanpole had already put the cups to her lip, and in one gulp she'd swallowed everything that was in it. Oh no. So we know that the spoonful made the hen smaller. So what do you think is going to happen to Grandma? She's going to get smaller. I wonder how small she will actually get. Mother, wailed Mrs. Cranky, you've just drunk 50 doses of George's Marvellous Medicine number 4. Look, that one tiny spoonful did that to our little brown hen. But Grandma didn't even hear her. Great clouds of steam were already pouring out of her mouth, and she was beginning to whistle. This is going to be interesting, Mr. Cranky said, still grinning. Now you've done it, cried Mrs. Cranky, glaring at her husband. You've cooked the old girl's goose. I didn't do anything, Mr. Cranky said. Oh, yes, you did. You told her to drink it. A tremendous hissing sound was coming from above their heads. Steam was shooting out of Grandma's mouth, nose and ears, and a whistling as it came. She'll feel better after she's let off a bit of steam, Mr. Cranky said. She's going to blow up, Mrs. Cranky wailed. Her boiler's going to burst. Stand clear, Mr. Cranky said. George was quite alarmed. He stood up and ran back a few paces. The jets of white steam kept squirting out of the skinny old hag's head, and whistling so high and shrill it hurt the ears. "Call the fire brigade," called Mrs. Cranky. "Call the police, man the hose pipes." "Too late," said Mr. Cranky, looking pleased. Grandma, shrieked Mrs. Cranky. "Mother, run to the drinking water and put your head under the water." But even as she spoke, the whistling suddenly stopped and the steam disappeared. That was when Grandma began to get smaller. She started off with her head as high as the roof of the house, but now she was coming down fast. "Watch this, George," Mr. Cranky shouted, hopping around the yard and flapping his arms. "Watch what happens when someone has 50 spoonfuls instead of one." Very soon Grandma was back to normal height. "Stop!" cried Mrs. Cranky. "That's just right." But she didn't stop. Smaller and smaller she got. Down and down she went. In another half a minute she was no bigger than a bottle of lemonade. "How do you feel, Mother?" asked Mrs. Cranky anxiously. Grandma's tiny face still bore the same foul and furious expression it had always had. Her eyes were no bigger than little keyholes and were blazed with anger. "How do I feel?" she yelled. "How do you think I feel? How would you feel if you'd been a glorious giant 1 minute and suddenly you're a miserable midget?" "She's still going," shouted Mr. Cranky gleefully. "She's getting smaller." And by golly, she was. When she was no bigger than a cigarette, Mrs. Cranky made a grab for her. She held her in her hands and cried, "How do I stop her from getting smaller still?" "You can't," Mr. Cranky said. "She's had 50 times the amount. I must stop her," Mrs. Cranky wailed. "I can hardly see her as it is." "Catch hold of each end and pull," Mr. Cranky said. By then Grandma was the size of a matchstick and was still shrinking faster. A moment later the size of a pin, then a pumpkin seed, then. "Where is she?" cried Mrs. Cranky. "I've lost her." "Hooray!" cried Mr. Cranky. "She's gone. She's disappeared completely," cried Mrs. Cranky. "That's what happens if you're grumpy and bad-tempered," cried Mr. Cranky. "Great medicine of yours, George." George didn't know what to think. For a few minutes Mrs. Cranky kept wandering around with a puzzled look on her face. "Mother, where are you? Where have you gone? Where have you got to? How can I find you?" But she calmed down quite quickly, and by lunchtime she was saying, "Oh, well, I suppose it was for the best, really. She was a bit of a nuisance around the house, wasn't she?" "Yes," said Mr. Cranky, "she most certainly was." George didn't say a word, but he felt quite trembled. He knew something tremendous had taken place that morning, but for a few brief moments he had touched with the very tips of his fingertips the edge of a magic world. So in the end, here's George, here's the little hen, and how do you think he's feeling at the end? He seems quite quiet. You could use the word sad, but I think we could try and think of a better word than sad. Maybe he's feeling a bit anxious, nervous. Maybe he's a bit curious. Maybe he's a bit nervous or worried about what's happened. Maybe he feels a bit guilty of what's happened to Grandma. He's very quiet. Well, that is the end of our story. It was a really, really good story. And all the time, when you have books like this, it tells you, gives you other books. So you've got The Fantastic Mr. Fox, Magic Finger, Draft Pelly and Me, The Enormous Crocodile. I like this one. I also like The Magic Finger. Revolting Rhymes, Dirty Beast. They're good ones. At the beginning, you've got The BFG, Matilda, James and the Giant Peach. The Twits, George the Marvellous, which we read. The Witches, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. Oh, The Wonderful World of Henry Sugar. Charlie and the Great Glass Elevator. Boy. Danny the Champion of the World, and Going Solo. And you're in for a surprise because, look, this is our next book, The Twits. And this was another favourite of mine when I was little. So we'll read that one next time. I hope you enjoyed George's Marvellous Medicine. See you next week. Bye.